She pressed the burning cigarette into the white tablecloth, watching the fabric blister and smoke. For 3 years, this woman terrorized every soul who walked through Il Destino's doors. Nobody dared to challenge her. Nobody even thought to try, until the night a waitress with shaking hands and a yellow folder full of ghosts decided to serve the truth as the final course. This is the story of how one woman brought down a monster. No, it's about something darker than that, about the dead who refused to stay buried. Stay with me. Welcome to the channel. Before we get started, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to remember where you were when you heard this one. Let me tell you a story about grief, ghosts, and what happens when a predator mistakes silence for weakness. In the heart of the city, there was a restaurant called Il Destino. Not just any restaurant. This was the kind of place where the silverware was polished until it gleamed like weapons, where the wine cost more than most people's rent, and where the scent of expensive cologne mixed with simmering fear. The crystal glasses caught the light like teardrops frozen in time. Even the shadows felt dangerous. And in this world of velvet booths and whispered deals, there was one name that made grown men flinch: Kim Dano. She wasn't the owner. She was something far more powerful. She was the mistress of Gabriele Riccardo, the Don who controlled half the territory south of the river. His money built empires. His name opened doors. But Kim, she built something different. She built a kingdom of cruelty on top of a dead woman's grave. Every Friday at 8 o'clock, she would glide through those doors like a queen inspecting her subjects, always dripping in silk and sapphires, always ready to destroy someone's life if their smile wasn't quite bright enough, if their hand trembled when they poured her wine, if they dared to exist in her presence without permission. There was Marco, a young busboy saving money to bring his mother from Sicily. He dropped a fork, just a fork, and Kim didn't just get him fired. She made sure he watched as they escorted him out in front of the Friday night crowd, his dreams crumbling with every step. According to the staff watching from the shadows, she didn't just smile. She looked bored, as if ruining his life was just a way to pass the time. That's the kind of woman Kim Dano was. Now, into this world of designer cruelty and silent suffering, walked a woman who didn't belong there. Sabrina Paul was 24 years old. To the customers, she was new. But the truth was, she had been blending into the walls for 3 years. Before that, she'd been working as a researcher for a private investigation firm. She was good at it too, connecting dots others missed, finding the truth hidden in the margins. But when she found the lead on the woman wearing her dead sister's jewelry, she didn't go to the police. She quit her job, changed her name, and intentionally adjusted the stiff collar of a waitress uniform, trying to remember which side the bread plate goes on, knowing she had fallen from a cliff and landed in a completely different universe for a reason. Except Sabrina wasn't here by accident. She remembered her first shift, 3 years ago, when an older waiter named Mario pulled her into the kitchen alcove. Mario had worked at Il Destino for 15 years. Every one of those years had carved lines into his face. "See that booth?" he had whispered, nodding toward the corner. "Table 1. That's where she sits. Kim Dano, the Don's woman. You know who Gabriele Riccardo is, right?" Sabrina nodded slowly. Everyone knew the Riccardo name. You didn't live in this city without knowing it. Mario's voice dropped even lower, almost lost beneath the clatter of dishes. "His mistress is our nightmare. One wrong move, one breath out of place, and she'll have you fired before you can apologize. And she won't stop there. She'll make sure you never work in this neighborhood again. I've watched her destroy people for sport." Sabrina felt ice spread through her chest. "Is she really that cruel?" Mario's laugh was sharp and bitter. Last month, a waiter's shadow fell across her plate while he was serving the table next to hers. He never even touched her food. She screamed that he'd contaminated her meal, that his presence was toxic. He was fired on the spot. I heard he had to leave the city to find work. Sabrina's hand moved unconsciously to the small locket hidden beneath her uniform. Inside that locket was a photograph of 2 little girls with matching smiles and tangled hair, their arms wrapped around each other like they'd never let go. But Mario didn't know that. Nobody here knew that Sabrina Paul wasn't really Sabrina Paul at all, that she'd changed her name, cut her hair, and walked into Il Destino with a purpose that had nothing to do with earning tips. She was here because 3 years ago, she'd made a promise to the dead. A promise to the woman whose sapphire earrings were currently dangling from Kim Dano's ears, earrings that should have been 6 feet underground. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to this moment, to understand why Sabrina's hands were shaking as she clutched that yellow folder, we need to go back. Back to 2 weeks ago. Back to the night Sabrina saw those earrings for the first time. It was a Thursday. Kim had come in early, without Gabrielle. She was meeting someone, a man in an expensive suit who kept his voice low and his eyes on the tablecloth. Sabrina was refilling water glasses, invisible the way good waitresses learn to be. Kim laughed at something the man said, throwing her head back. And that's when the light caught them. The earrings, vintage sapphires set in white gold, surrounded by tiny diamonds that sparkled like frozen tears. Sabrina's hand froze. The water pitcher tilted dangerously. She barely caught it before it spilled. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she thought everyone in the restaurant could hear it. She knew those earrings. Not from a catalog or a store window. She knew them because 5 years ago, she'd watched her big sister, Elena, wear them on her wedding day. She'd watched Elena touch them nervously as she walked down the aisle toward Gabriele Riccardo, the man she loved more than life itself. And 3 months after that wedding, Sabrina had watched them close Elena's casket with those same earrings still on her ears. She should have something beautiful with her, Gabriele had said, his voice breaking. She deserves to be beautiful forever. Sabrina had been 19 then, just a kid in Gabriele's eyes. He barely noticed her at the funeral. He was drowning in grief, a man shattered by the sudden loss of his wife in what everyone called a tragic car accident. But Sabrina noticed everything. She noticed how Gabriele's brother Stefano didn't cry. She noticed how quickly the investigation closed. She noticed how alone Gabriele became. And when her own life fell apart 2 years later, when she had nothing left to lose, she made a choice. She changed her name. She dyed her hair. She became invisible. And she came to Il Destino to keep the promise she'd whispered over her sister's grave. I won't let them destroy you. I won't let them destroy him. So when Sabrina saw those earrings swinging from Kim Dano's ears, she didn't just see jewelry. She saw desecration. She saw a grave robbed. She saw a predator who'd literally stolen from the dead to manipulate a grieving man. That night, Sabrina started building the folder. The yellow folder that was now hidden in her locker, growing heavier with every piece of evidence she collected. Kim's real name, her surgical records, the photos of her old apartment that looked like a shrine to Elena, the bank transfers from Stefano's account. Everything. Tonight was different though. Tonight, the restaurant was packed. The air felt electric, dangerous. Kim sat at table 1 in a dress the color of fresh blood, those sapphire earrings catching every flicker of candlelight, and beside her sat Gabriele Riccardo. 34 years old, dark hair styled back, a tattoo of a cross just visible above his collar. He looked tired. More than tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of ghosts. He smiled at Kim, but the smile never reached his eyes. Those eyes were still somewhere else, still 5 years in the past, still reaching for a woman who was never coming back. Sabrina stood by the kitchen station, her hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. She'd watched this for 3 years. Watched Kim isolate Gabriele from his family. Watched her fire loyal staff members who'd worked for the Riccardo family for decades. Watched her spend his money like water while he barely noticed, too lost in grief to see he was being devoured alive. But tonight felt different. There was tension in the air, something electric and wrong. And then Sabrina saw it. Kim, smiling that cruel smile, lifted her cigarette. A young waitress, new, maybe 18, approached nervously. I'm sorry, ma'am, but smoking isn't allowed inside. She never got to finish. Kim looked her dead in the eye and pressed the burning cigarette into the pristine white tablecloth. The fabric hissed. Smoke curled up. A perfect black hole bloomed in the center. Now the table is ruined, Kim said, her voice loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Get me another one. The girl stood frozen, tears starting to well up. Gabriele didn't even look up from his phone, and that's when Sabrina made her decision. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. She turned and walked toward the staff lockers, her heart pounding like thunder. Her hands were shaking as she opened the metal door and pulled out the yellow folder. The Book of the Dead. Mario grabbed her arm. Sabrina, what are you doing? But she pulled away. She didn't answer. She couldn't, because if she opened her mouth she'd scream. She walked back onto the floor, the folder pressed against her chest like armor. Kim was laughing about something, her head thrown back, those earrings swinging. Gabriele was staring at nothing, a man already half dead from grief, and Sabrina realized with crystal clarity. Tonight, the dead were finally going to speak. 2 weeks ago, Sabrina didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in evidence, in paperwork, in the cold, hard facts that couldn't lie even when people did. But that Thursday night changed everything. That was the night the dead started speaking. It had been a slow evening. Kim came in alone, which was rare. She usually arrived on Gabriele's arm like a possession he didn't realize was slowly poisoning him. But that night she sat at table 1 with a man Sabrina didn't recognize. Expensive suit, nervous eyes, the kind of man who kept checking the door like he expected someone to walk through it and end his life. Sabrina moved through her section with the practiced invisibility of a woman who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. Water pitcher in hand, eyes down, just another piece of furniture in a room full of people who mattered. She approached table 1 to refill their glasses. The man was talking in a low, urgent voice. Something about shipments and timing. Kim listened with that predatory stillness she had, like a cat watching a bird with a broken wing. And then she laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, all performance and no joy. She threw her head back, and that's when the light hit them. The earrings. Vintage sapphires set in white gold, each stone surrounded by a constellation of tiny diamonds. They caught the candlelight and threw it back in sharp, cold flashes, and Sabrina's entire world stopped. The water pitcher tilted in her hand. She caught it half a second before the water would have spilled across the white tablecloth, but her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the handle with both fists. Her heart wasn't beating anymore. It was slamming against her ribs like it was trying to break through bone and escape. Because she knew those earrings. Not from a photograph, not from a catalog. She knew them the way you know your own face in the mirror. She knew them because she'd watched her sister wear them on the happiest day of her life. Elena. Beautiful. Laughing Elena who'd looked like an angel in her wedding dress. Who'd touched those earrings nervously as she'd walked down the aisle toward the man she loved with every piece of her soul. Gabriele had given them to her the night before the wedding. They'd belonged to his grandmother, he'd said. A family heirloom for the woman who would carry the family name. And 3 months later, when they'd closed Elena's casket, those earrings had still been on her ears. Sabrina remembered Gabriele's voice, broken and raw with grief. She should have something beautiful with her. She deserves to be beautiful forever. Sabrina had been 19 then, just a kid. Elena's little sister who Gabriele had barely noticed at the funeral because he'd been drowning in a grief so deep it looked like he might never surface. But Sabrina had noticed everything. She'd noticed how quickly the police had closed the investigation into the car accident. She'd noticed how Gabriele's brother Stefano hadn't shed a single tear. She'd noticed how the family had scattered like birds after a gunshot, leaving Gabriele alone in that massive house full of ghosts. And now, 5 years later, those earrings were swinging from a stranger's ears, from the ears of a woman who laughed like broken glass and smiled when she destroyed people. Sabrina backed away from the table before her legs gave out. She made it to the kitchen before the shaking spread from her hands to her entire body. She leaned against the cold steel of the industrial sink and tried to breathe, tried to think, because there was only one way those earrings could be here. Only one impossible, horrifying explanation. Someone had opened Elena's grave. Someone had reached into that casket and stolen the jewelry off a corpse. And that someone had given them to Kim Dano. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. This wasn't some twisted coincidence. Kim hadn't bought those earrings at an estate sale or found them in a vintage shop. She'd researched Gabriele. She'd studied his dead wife. She'd learned what Elena looked like, how she dressed, what perfume she wore. And then she'd hired someone to dig up Elena's grave and rob it, to steal the very jewelry Gabriele had buried with his wife so she could wear it and trigger some subconscious recognition in his grief-soaked brain, so she could become the ghost, so she could manipulate him on a level so deep he'd never even know it was happening. Sabrina thought about the past 3 years, about how Kim had slowly changed her appearance, the hair color that had shifted from blonde to the same rich brown Elena had worn, the perfume that smelled like jasmine and rain, just like Elena's signature scent. The way Kim laughed sometimes, that specific rhythm that Sabrina recognized because she'd heard it 1,000 times growing up. Kim wasn't Gabrielle's girlfriend. She wasn't his mistress. She was a predator, a grave robber who studied grieving widowers and became their dead wives piece by piece, stealing from corpses to complete the costume. And Gabriele, lost in his grief, never saw it. He thought she reminded him of Elena. He thought it was fate. He had no idea he was sleeping next to a woman who desecrated his wife's grave. That night, Sabrina stopped being careful. She stopped being patient. She went home to her tiny apartment, and she started building the file. The yellow folder that would eventually hold everything. She called in every favor she had left from her old job. She tracked down Kim's real name, Loretta Vance, born in Ohio, no family. A string of relationships with wealthy widowers that all ended the same way. The men left broken, their bank accounts empty, their reputations destroyed. She found the surgical records from a clinic in Brazil. A hysterectomy performed 3 years ago, which meant the pregnancy Kim had just announced was a biological impossibility. She found the bank transfers from Stefano's account to Kim's. She found photographs of Kim's old apartment, and when she saw them, she understood the full horror of what she was dealing with. Every wall had been covered with pictures of Elena. Kim had built a shrine to a dead woman so she could study her prey. Now, standing in Il Destino with that folder pressed against her chest, Sabrina watched Kim touch her earlobe. A casual gesture, unconscious. But Sabrina saw it for what it was. A reminder. A trophy. Kim thought she'd won. She thought she'd fooled everyone. She had no idea that Elena's little sister had been watching her every move for 3 years, had been documenting every crime, had been waiting for exactly the right moment to serve justice cold. The anger burning in Sabrina's chest wasn't professional anymore. This wasn't about doing the right thing or protecting an innocent man. This was personal. This was blood. This was a promise made over a grave that someone had violated. And tonight, that promise was going to be kept. Tonight, the dead were going to get their revenge, and Sabrina was going to be the one to deliver it. Gabriele Riccardo was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that lived in your bones, in the hollow space behind your ribs where your heart used to beat properly. He sat at table 1, the same table he'd sat at every Friday for 5 years, and he felt nothing. Nothing but the weight. Always the weight. He touched the tattoo on his neck without thinking. His fingers traced the delicate script inked into his skin. Elena's name, her birth date and the date she'd left him. A memorial he carried everywhere because forgetting wasn't an option, even when remembering felt like drowning. The ink was raised slightly, still sensitive after all these years, like the grief itself. A scar that never quite healed. Kim was talking. She was always talking. About something. About nothing. Her voice was like background music in a restaurant, present but not really heard. He nodded when it seemed appropriate. He smiled when her tone suggested he should. But his mind was somewhere else. It was always somewhere else. In a car wrapped around a telephone pole. In a hospital room where the machines had gone silent. In a grave where he'd buried the only woman he'd ever loved, along with half of himself. Gabriella, are you even listening to me? Kim's voice cut through the fog. Sharp, irritated. He looked up, trying to focus. She was beautiful, he supposed. Dark hair, red dress, jewelry that caught the light. She reminded him of someone, though he could never quite place who. That's why he'd let her stay, wasn't it? Because sometimes, when she laughed or turned her head a certain way, he felt something. Not happiness, but an echo of what happiness used to feel like. And an echo was better than silence. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough. I'm just tired. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. They were always cold. You're always tired, baby. You work too hard. You need to take care of yourself. Her voice had that tone, the one that made him feel guilty for being broken. Like his grief was an inconvenience she'd learned to tolerate. But she was trying, wasn't she? She stayed when everyone else had left, when his brother had disappeared into his own life, when his friends had stopped calling because they didn't know what to say to a man who couldn't stop mourning. The waiter brought their appetizers. Gabriele wasn't hungry. He was never hungry anymore. Food tasted like cardboard. Everything tasted like nothing. Kim picked at her salad and talked about redecorating the house. His house. The house he'd shared with Elena. We could paint the bedroom, Kim was saying. Something brighter, more cheerful. All that dark furniture is so depressing. He felt something twist in his chest. That furniture had been Elena's. She'd spent months finding the perfect pieces. But he didn't say anything. He never said anything anymore. And I was thinking, Kim continued, her voice taking on that careful, measured tone she used when she wanted something. Maybe we could finally take down some of those photos. I know she was important to you, but it's been 5 years, Gabriele. Don't you think it's time to move forward? His hand tightened around his wine glass. The crystal stem felt fragile, like it might snap. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended, sharper. Kim's eyes widened. Her mouth opened in a perfect O of shock. I just meant... She started, but he cut her off. I said no, Kim. The photos stay. For a moment, just a moment, he saw something flicker across her face. Something cold and calculating that disappeared so fast he thought he'd imagined it. And then she flinched. A full-body flinch, like he'd raised his hand to her. Like he'd threatened her. Her chair scraped back. Her hands came up defensively. Please, she whispered, but the whisper was loud. Loud enough for the tables around them to hear. Loud enough for heads to turn. Please, I didn't mean to upset you. Gabriele felt his blood turn to ice. Kim, I didn't. But she was standing now, backing away from the table, her eyes wide and terrified. Theatrical. That was the word that flashed through his mind. This looked theatrical. But why would she? I need to use the restroom, she said, her voice trembling. She touched her arm gently, like it hurt, and Gabriele saw several diners watching them. Watching him. Their eyes held judgment, suspicion, the kind of looks you give a man who hurts women. He sat frozen as Kim hurried away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. He looked down at his hands. These hands had never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. These hands had held Elena when she'd cried, had cradled her face on their wedding night, had touched her cheek one last time before they'd closed the casket. What was happening? Why did he feel like he was losing his mind? He rubbed his temples, trying to push back the headache that was building behind his eyes. The weight was crushing him. The grief was crushing him. And now this, whatever this was. Across the restaurant, hidden in the shadows near the kitchen, Sabrina watched Gabriele fall apart. She'd seen the whole thing, seen how Kim had baited him, how she'd turned a simple disagreement into a performance. And when Kim had rushed past her toward the restroom, Sabrina had followed. She kept her distance, staying in the hallway's blind spot. Through the crack in the restroom door that hadn't quite closed, she saw everything. Kim wasn't crying. She wasn't upset. She was standing at the mirror, smiling. That cold, cruel smile that never touched her eyes. And in her hand was a makeup compact. But not the kind for beauty. This was theatrical makeup, the kind actors used for special effects. Sabrina watched, her stomach turning, as Kim carefully applied brown and purple pigment to her forearms. She blended it expertly, creating shadows that looked exactly like fingerprint bruises. The kind of marks a man's hands would leave if he'd grabbed a woman too hard, if he'd hurt her. Kim took a photo with her phone, capturing the fake bruises from several angles. And then she pulled out her phone and started typing. Sabrina couldn't see the screen, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly what Kim was doing. She was building evidence, documenting abuse that had never happened, creating a narrative where Gabriele was the monster and Kim was the victim. And when the time was right, she'd use it to destroy him completely. Sabrina's hands clenched into fists. She backed away before Kim could see her, her mind racing. This was worse than she'd thought. Kim wasn't just stealing from Gabriele. She was setting him up, framing him for crimes he'd never committed. Sabrina moved back to her station and watched Gabriele through the chaos of the dinner service. He looked lost, confused, like a man who couldn't understand why his world kept crumbling no matter how hard he tried to hold the pieces together. And he had no idea that the woman he'd let into his life, into his bed, into his grief, was the one wielding the hammer. Kim emerged from the restroom 5 minutes later. Her makeup was perfect. Her bruises were hidden under long sleeves now, but Sabrina knew they were there, waiting. Kim walked back to table 1 slowly, her steps careful, hesitant. When she reached Gabriele, she didn't sit down immediately. She stood beside the table, her body language screaming fear. And then, in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent restaurant, she whispered, "Please don't hurt me, Gabriele." The room froze. Every conversation died. Every eye turned to table 1, to the powerful man who looked devastated, and to the beautiful woman who looked terrified. Sabrina's heart shattered, because she knew, even if no one else did. The monster at that table wasn't wearing a suit. She was wearing a red dress and stolen earrings, and she was just getting started. Kim sat down slowly, milking every second of her performance. She dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. Gabriele looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to figure out how he'd gotten there. The other diners had gone back to their meals, but their glances kept sliding toward table 1, judging, wondering. Already writing the story in their heads, Sabrina moved through the room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, her movements mechanical while her mind raced. She approached table 1 with a bottle of red, the label facing out the way Mario had taught her. Professional, invisible, just another waitress doing her job. Kim was talking in a soft voice now, the kind that forced Gabriele to lean in close to hear her, playing the victim so perfectly it would have been impressive if it weren't so vile. Sabrina tilted the bottle, pouring the wine into Kim's glass with steady hands even though everything inside her was screaming. And that's when she saw it. Kim's phone, face up on the table beside her napkin. The screen lit up with a new message. But it wasn't the message that made Sabrina's blood freeze. It was the name at the top of the conversation thread. Stefano. Not Mom, not Sarah, or Jessica, or any other woman's name. Stefano, Gabriele's brother. The man who'd left the family business 3 years ago, claiming he wanted a different life. The man who hadn't come to visit Gabriele in over a year. The man who'd stopped calling, stopped caring, stopped being family. Sabrina's hand didn't shake as she finished pouring, but her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. She moved to Gabriele's glass, her angle shifting just enough to catch the preview of the message on Kim's screen. Is it done? Did you plant it? The words burned into her brain. She stepped back, professional smile in place, and moved away from the table. But her mind was already connecting dots that formed a picture so ugly she wanted to scrub her eyes. Stefano. Kim was working with Stefano. This wasn't just a predator finding a mark. This was a conspiracy. Family betrayal wrapped in a designer dress and fake tears. Sabrina thought about everything she'd learned over the past 3 years. How Stefano had always been jealous of his older brother. How he'd wanted to be Don but didn't have the respect, the strength, the loyalty that Gabriele commanded. How he'd disappeared right around the time Kim had appeared in Gabriele's life. It hadn't been a coincidence. None of it had been a coincidence. Stefano had hired Kim to destroy his brother from the inside out. To seduce him, isolate him, frame him, and take everything. The territory, the power, the throne that Stefano thought should have been his, by right of wanting it badly enough. And Kim wasn't just his hired gun. Sabrina's stomach turned as the pieces clicked into place. They were lovers. All those times Kim claimed to be visiting her sick mother out of town, she'd been with Stefano, sleeping in hotels that Gabriele's money paid for, planning his destruction between satin sheets. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Sabrina gripped her tray so hard her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream, wanted to flip the table and drag Kim out by her hair. But she forced herself to breathe, to wait, to watch. Kim picked up her phone, typed something back quickly, then set it face down on the table. She reached across and took Gabriele's hand, the one with the wedding ring he'd never taken off even though Elena had been gone for 5 years. Gabriele, Kim said, her voice suddenly bright. Excited. I have news, darling. She paused, building the moment like an actress who knew exactly how to work her audience. We're going to have a baby. The restaurant noise faded into white static. Sabrina watched Gabriele's face transform. The grief that had lived there, like a permanent shadow, lifted. Just for a second. His eyes, those dark eyes that had been dead for so long, suddenly lit up with something Sabrina hadn't seen in 3 years of watching him. Hope. Pure, devastating hope. What? His voice cracked. Kim, are you serious? You're pregnant? Kim nodded, tears streaming down her face now. Real tears, or maybe just perfectly executed fake ones. I found out this morning. I was scared to tell you. I didn't know how you'd feel about it, after everything. Gabriele stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He pulled Kim up and wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was something precious, something that could save him from drowning. And across the restaurant, hidden by a tray of dirty plates and a practiced blank expression, Sabrina felt her heart shatter into pieces so small they could never be put back together. Because she knew. She'd seen the medical records in her folder. The surgical report from a clinic in Sao Paulo, Brazil, dated 3 years ago. Hysterectomy due to complications from endometriosis. Complete removal of the uterus. Kim Dano, or Loretta Vance, or whatever her real name was, could not have children. It was a biological impossibility. The pregnancy was a lie. Another weapon. Another trap. But Gabriele didn't know that. He was smiling for the first time in years, holding the woman who was going to destroy him, believing that maybe, just maybe, he could have a family again. That maybe the universe hadn't taken everything from him. That maybe he deserved a second chance at happiness. And Kim let him hold her, let him believe, because she knew this lie was the cruelest one yet. This wasn't just stealing his money or his reputation. This was stealing his hope. Giving it to him just so she could rip it away when the timing was perfect. When it would hurt the most. Sabrina turned and walked toward the kitchen before anyone could see the tears burning in her eyes. Her sister's voice echoed in her memory, from years ago when they were just kids. "Promise me, Brina. Promise me if anything ever happens to me, you'll look after him. Gabriele's strong, but inside he's soft. He needs someone to protect him from people who would take advantage of that," Sabrina had promised. And tonight, she was going to keep that promise, even if it meant burning Il Destino to the ground. Even if it meant revealing who she really was. Even if it meant starting a war with the most dangerous man in the city, because the dead were screaming now, and she was the only one who could hear them. The atmosphere in Il Destino changed. Sabrina felt it the moment she stepped back onto the floor from the kitchen. The air had gone cold, sharp, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the span of a breath. Outside, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. Rain began to hit the windows, soft at first, then harder, insistent. The kind of rain that sounded like accusations. The crystal chandeliers swayed slightly, casting moving shadows across the white tablecloths. Even the other diners seemed to feel it. Conversations dropped to whispers. Silverware clinked against plates with a nervous rhythm. At table 1, Gabriele loosened his tie. His face was flushed, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the sudden chill. The stress was eating him alive from the inside out. The pregnancy announcement, the public scene, the weight of grief he carried like chains wrapped around his chest. It was all too much. Too hot, too suffocating. He stood up slightly and shrugged out of his suit jacket. The expensive black fabric slipped off his shoulders, revealing the white dress shirt underneath. The sleeves were rolled to his elbows, showing forearms marked with scars and ink. A working man's arms, despite the money and power. He hung the jacket carefully on the back of his chair, the way men do when they're trying to maintain composure while everything inside them is falling apart. Kim watched him with those calculating eyes, and then she smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made Sabrina's skin crawl every time she saw it. "Let me help you, baby," Kim said softly. She stood up and moved around the table, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. She reached for Gabriele's jacket, her fingers gentle as they smoothed the collar. "You're so tense," she murmured. "You need to relax." Her hands moved over the fabric, straightening it, adjusting it. An affectionate gesture. A loving gesture. The kind of thing a concerned girlfriend would do for her stressed partner. Sabrina was clearing the table 2 booths away, but her eyes never left Kim's hands. And that's when she saw it. Time seemed to slow down, the way it does in car accidents or moments before everything changes forever. Kim's right hand dipped into her purse, which hung on the back of her chair. The movement was smooth, practiced. She pulled something out, keeping it concealed in her palm. And then, while her left hand continued to adjust Gabriele's collar, her right hand slipped into the inner pocket of his jacket, the pocket that hung against the back of the chair, invisible to everyone in the restaurant except Sabrina, who was standing at exactly the right angle to see everything. Kim deposited something heavy, something metal, something that made the jacket sag slightly with new weight, and then she pulled her hand back, empty, and returned to her seat. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds, maybe less, fast enough that no one would notice, smooth enough that even if they had noticed, it would have looked like nothing. Just a woman adjusting her boyfriend's jacket, just an act of care. Sabrina's heart stopped beating. She knew what Kim had just done, She knew what was in that pocket, not because she could see it, but because 2 hours ago, her phone had buzzed with an alert from the police scanner app she still kept from her old job. Federal Judge Anthony Romano had been shot and killed outside his home in Westchester. 2 shots to the chest, close range, a .38 caliber revolver, no witnesses, no suspects. But Romano had been presiding over a case involving the Ricardo family's business interests, a case that could have sent half of Gabrielle's associates to prison. The gun in Gabrielle's jacket was a .38. Sabrina would bet her life on it, and she'd bet her life that it was the same gun that had killed Judge Romano. Kim hadn't just planted evidence. She'd planted a murder weapon, fresh, still warm, still carrying the smell of gunpowder and death. And any minute now, the police would walk through those doors. They wouldn't be coming to ask questions. They'd be coming with a warrant, coming to search, coming to find exactly what Stefano had made sure they'd find. Gabriele Ricardo, the Don, sitting in his favorite restaurant with a murder weapon in his jacket pocket. Case closed. Life sentence, throne empty. And Stefano would slide into power like he'd always dreamed, with Kim by his side and Gabriele rotting in a cell, broken and betrayed by everyone he'd trusted. Sabrina's hands started shaking so hard she had to set down the tray she was holding before she dropped it. The crash of breaking glass would have given her away. She pressed her back against the wall near the kitchen entrance, her mind racing faster than her heart. She'd planned this so carefully. She'd spent 3 years building the folder, collecting evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to expose Kim for what she really was. She'd imagined confronting her at the end of the night, following them to the parking lot maybe, slipping the folder onto Gabrielle's windshield with a note, giving him time to process, time to verify, time to protect himself before making any moves. But there was no time now. The clock wasn't ticking. It had already run out. The police were probably already on their way. Maybe they were already outside, waiting for some signal from Kim that the weapon was in place. Sabrina thought about the text message she'd seen earlier. "Is it done? Did you plant it?" That hadn't been about bruises or lies. That had been about the gun, about the final piece of the trap clicking into place. If Sabrina waited, if she hesitated, if she stuck to her careful plan, Gabriele would be arrested tonight, in front of everyone, dragged out of Il Destino in handcuffs while Kim cried her fake tears and played the shocked girlfriend. And by the time anyone looked at Sabrina's folder, by the time anyone considered that maybe Kim wasn't who she claimed to be, it would be too late. The narrative would be set. The Don who killed a federal judge, the monster who deserved everything he got. Sabrina looked across the restaurant at table 1. Gabriele was drinking his wine, oblivious. His jacket hung on the chair behind him, heavy with the weight of his own destruction. Kim was checking her phone again, probably reading another message from Stefano, probably confirming the timing, probably feeling very pleased with herself. And Sabrina made a choice, not the safe choice, not the smart choice, but the only choice that mattered. She turned and walked toward the staff lockers. Her hands were steady now, steady with purpose, steady with rage. She opened her locker and pulled out the yellow folder. The Book of the Dead. 3 years of work. 3 years of evidence. 3 years of promises kept to a sister who was buried 6 feet underground with empty ears because the woman at table 1 had robbed her grave. Sabrina held the folder against her chest and walked back onto the floor. The rain was coming down harder now. Thunder rumbled in the distance. And somewhere in the city, sirens were probably already screaming, coming closer, coming for Gabriele, but they'd have to go through her first. Tonight, the dead were going to speak, and everyone was going to listen. Sabrina stood in front of the staff locker room mirror and looked at herself. Really looked. For 3 years, she'd been nobody. A ghost in a black vest and white shirt. A woman who poured wine and cleared plates and made herself so small that people forgot she existed the moment she walked away. That had been the point. To be invisible. To watch. To gather evidence without being noticed. But tonight, that woman was gone. Sabrina touched the locket hidden beneath her uniform. Inside it was a photograph of 2 little girls who'd promised to protect each other forever. She'd kept her promise. And now it was time to collect the debt. She checked her reflection one last time. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, cold. She picked up the yellow folder from the bench where she'd set it and held it against her chest like armor. This wasn't just evidence. This was 3 years of rage compressed into paper and photographs. This was justice for a woman who'd been buried with empty ears because a predator had robbed her grave. Sabrina turned away from the mirror and walked toward the door. Sabrina, the waitress, was dead. Elena's sister was walking into the fire. The restaurant floor felt different as she crossed it. The conversations seemed distant, muffled, like she was moving underwater. The rain hammered against the windows in a steady rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Thunder rolled somewhere close. The chandeliers swayed, throwing dancing shadows across the white tablecloths. Sabrina's heels clicked against the marble, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the room. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever looked at her. That was about to change. At table 1, Kim was dabbing her lips with her napkin. She set it down carefully and reached for her purse. "I need to powder my nose," she said to Gabriella, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that made Sabrina's skin crawl. She was checking her phone again. Probably another message from Stefano. Probably a signal that the police were close. Time to disappear to the restroom so she'd have an alibi. So she wouldn't be sitting next to Gabriella when they found the gun. So she could play the innocent girlfriend who had no idea her boyfriend was a murderer. Kim stood up, smoothing her red dress. She turned toward the restroom, her heels clicking with confidence, with victory, and Sabrina stepped directly into her path. Kim stopped short, almost stumbling. Her eyes went wide with surprise, then narrowed with irritation. She looked at Sabrina the way people look at furniture that's suddenly in the wrong place. Annoying, inconvenient. Beneath notice. "Excuse me," Kim said, her voice sharp. "Move." But Sabrina didn't move. She stood her ground, the yellow folder pressed against her chest, her eyes locked on Kim's face, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, loud enough for table 1 to hear, loud enough for the tables around them to hear. "Sit down, Loretta." The name hit Kim like a physical blow. Sabrina watched the color drain from her face, watched her eyes go wide with shock, and then fear, real fear, not the theatrical kind she'd performed earlier. The kind that comes when you realize the prey you've been hunting just bared its teeth. "What did you call me?" Kim's voice was a whisper, shaking, because nobody here knew that name. Nobody in this city knew that name. Kim Dano didn't exist before 3 years ago, but Loretta Vance did, and Loretta Vance had a history, a trail of broken men and empty bank accounts and graves that had been disturbed. Gabriele looked up from his wineglass, confusion creasing his face. "Sabrina?" His voice was rough with surprise. "What are you doing?" He'd never said her name before. In 3 years of serving him, he'd never once looked at her long enough to remember she existed. But he was looking now. Everyone was looking now. The conversations at the nearby tables had died. People were turning in their seats, sensing drama, sensing blood in the water. Kim's face twisted. The mask slipped for just a second, revealing something ugly underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Get out of my way, you crazy." But she didn't get to finish, because Sabrina lifted the yellow folder and slammed it down onto the white tablecloth. The sound cracked through the restaurant like a gunshot. Wine glasses rattled. Silverware jumped. The folder landed right in front of Gabriele. It was a plain, unassuming yellow folder, but it landed with the weight of a bomb. In Sabrina's mind, she called it the Book of the Dead. Inside lay everything he needed to know about the woman wearing his wife's jewelry. Gabriele stared at the folder like it was a bomb, like it might explode if he touched it. His hand moved toward it, hesitated, then pulled back. He looked up at Sabrina with those dark eyes that carried 5 years of grief. "What is this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Sabrina's eyes never left Kim's face. She watched the panic spread, watched Kim's hands clench into fists, watched her take a step back, then another, like she was preparing to run. "Open it," Sabrina said to Gabriele. Her voice was calm, cold. The voice of someone who'd waited 3 years for this moment and wasn't going to be stopped now. "Open it and look at the first photograph. Look at what she's wearing." Kim lunged forward, reaching for the folder. "Don't you dare." But Sabrina was faster. She grabbed Kim's wrist, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to stop her cold. They stood there, frozen, 2 women locked in a battle that had been building for 3 years. Kim's eyes were wild now, desperate. She jerked her arm, trying to break free, but Sabrina's grip was iron. "Let go of me," Kim snarled. You're fired. You're insane. Gabrielle, call security. The earrings, Sabrina said, cutting through Kim's hysteria. She spoke directly to Gabrielle now. Her voice was steady, but there was something breaking underneath it. Something raw and wounded. Look at the earrings she's wearing. Then look at the photograph in the folder, the one of your wife in her casket. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Gabrielle's hand shook as he reached for the folder. His fingers touched the manila edge, and in that moment, everything changed. The air turned electric. The past and present collided. The dead opened their eyes, and Sabrina finally let herself breathe. Gabrielle's fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the yellow folder. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the words written across the front. The Book of the Dead. He looked up at Sabrina, searching her face for something. An explanation. A reason. But all he saw was a woman he'd never really looked at before, standing like a soldier going to war. He opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, and the world stopped. It was Elena. His Elena, lying in her casket on the day they'd buried her. The white satin lining. The flowers arranged around her like she was sleeping in a garden. Her hands folded across her chest. And on her ears, catching the light from the funeral home's lamps, were the sapphire earrings, his grandmother's earrings. The family heirloom he'd given her the night before their wedding. The jewelry he'd insisted she be buried with, because she deserved to be beautiful forever. The photograph was dated 5 years ago, the day he'd said goodbye to the only woman he'd ever loved. Gabrielle's breath caught in his chest. His hand moved to his mouth like he was going to be sick, and then, slowly, like a man in a nightmare, his eyes moved from the photograph to Kim, to the earrings dangling from her ears, vintage sapphires set in white gold, surrounded by tiny diamonds. Identical. Exactly identical. Not similar. Not inspired by. The same. His vision blurred. His hands started shaking. Where did you get those? His voice was barely human. Raw. Broken. Sabrina's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She didn't buy them at Tiffany's, boss. She paused, letting the weight of what she was about to say settle over the room. She dug them up. The words landed like bombs. Gabriella stared at Kim, at the woman he'd let into his bed, into his life, into his grief. What? The word came out strangled. What did you just say? Kim was backing away, her hands up. She's crazy, Gabrielle. She's obsessed with you. She's making this up. But Sabrina stepped forward, her voice rising. Tell him, Loretta. Tell him how you hired someone to open Elena's grave. How you stole jewelry off a corpse so you could wear it and trigger his subconscious. How you studied his dead wife like a research project so you could become her ghost. Kim's face was white. That's not true. That's insane. But Gabrielle wasn't listening to her anymore. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward and crashed against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and grabbed Kim's face, his hand rough, his grip desperate. He turned her head, looking at the earrings up close, looking for some difference, some proof that this was a mistake. But there was none. He could see the tiny scratch on the left earring's setting, the imperfection he'd noticed when his grandmother had worn them. The same imperfection. These weren't replicas. These were Elena's earrings, the ones that should have been buried with her body. Gabrielle made a sound that wasn't quite human, a roar of agony and rage that came from somewhere so deep it felt like his soul was tearing apart. He reached up and ripped the earring from Kim's ear. The post tore through her earlobe. Blood welled up, dripping down her neck onto her red dress. Kim screamed. But Gabrielle didn't care. He held the earring up to the light, his hand shaking. You desecrated her? His voice broke on the words. You opened her grave? You touched her? Tears were streaming down his face now. 5 years of grief turning into something darker, something murderous. There's more, Sabrina said quietly. As Kim lunged forward to grab the folder, her stomach bumped hard against the edge of the table. A sharp, high-pitched screech of electronic feedback pierced the air, the undeniable sound of a microphone rubbing against fabric. Sabrina pointed to Kim's midsection. That's not a heartbeat, boss. That's a wire. She reached into the folder and pulled out a paper. Medical records stamped with official seals. She threw it onto the table. The pregnancy is a lie. She had a hysterectomy 3 years ago in Brazil. There is no baby, Gabriele. Just a recording device to trap you. Gabriele's eyes went to the paper, to the clinical language documenting a procedure that made pregnancy impossible. He looked back at Kim, and something in him broke completely. You lied about a baby? His voice was dead now. Cold. The voice of a man who'd stopped being human and become something else. Something dangerous. And check your jacket, Sabrina said, pointing to the chair behind him. The one hanging right there. Check the inner pocket. Gabriele turned slowly, like he was moving through water. He reached for his jacket. His hand slipped into the inner pocket, and when he pulled it out, he was holding a gun. A .38 snub-nose revolver. The weight of it told him everything. This wasn't his gun. He'd never seen this gun before. But it was in his jacket, in his pocket, and everyone in this restaurant had just watched him pull it out. Federal Judge Romano was killed with that exact caliber 2 hours ago, Sabrina said. Her voice was steady, but there were tears in her eyes now. She planted it on you. The police are probably already on their way. She was going to frame you for murder, send you to prison. Let Stefano take over everything. Your territory, your power, your life. The name hit Gabriele like another blow. Stefano? He looked at Kim. What does my brother have to do with this? And that's when Kim finally broke. The mask she'd worn for 3 years shattered completely. Her posh accent vanished, replaced by something harsh, something ugly. You stupid son of a bitch, she snarled. You think you're so smart? So powerful? You're pathetic. A grief-stricken fool who couldn't see what was right in front of his face. Stefano's twice the man you'll ever be. And when you're rotting in prison, he'll be sitting in your chair, sleeping in your bed, running your empire. She laughed, and the sound was poisonous. And I'll be right there with him, spending every dollar you ever made. The restaurant erupted. People were standing up. Phones were coming out. Someone was calling the police. But Gabriele heard none of it. He was staring at Kim like he'd never seen her before. Because he hadn't. He'd been looking at a ghost for 3 years. At a woman who didn't exist. And the real monster had been hiding behind her face the whole time. Sabrina watched him break. Watched the strongest man she'd ever known fall to pieces. And she knew that in about 30 seconds, the doors were going to burst open. The police were going to flood in. And everything was going to go to hell. But at least he knew the truth now. At least Elena's ghost could rest. At least the dead had finally spoken. And everyone had heard them scream. The front doors exploded inward. Not opened, exploded. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass cut through the chaos of the restaurant like a blade. Blue and red lights flooded through the entrance, painting everything in strobing colors. Police, at least a dozen of them, moving in formation, guns drawn, faces hard. This wasn't a welfare check. This was a raid. They'd come prepared to take down a killer. And walking through the door behind them, wearing a smile that could cut glass, was Stefano Riccardo. He looked like his brother. Same dark hair, same strong jaw, same build. But where Gabriele carried grief like a second skin, Stefano wore ambition like armor. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hands in his pockets, casual as if he was walking into a restaurant for dinner instead of watching his brother's life end. Behind him was a man in a captain's uniform. Corrupt. Had to be. The way he moved, the way he looked at Stefano for direction, it was all wrong. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. Stefano's eyes scanned the restaurant until they found Gabriele. And then he smiled wider. He'd expected to see his brother confused, panicking, holding a murder weapon he didn't understand while Kim played the terrified girlfriend. He'd expected to watch Gabriele get dragged out in handcuffs while he stepped into the throne that should have always been his. But something was wrong. Gabriele wasn't confused. He was standing there, rage burning in his eyes like hellfire, holding the gun. But he wasn't holding it like a man who'd been caught. He was holding it like a man who knew exactly what was happening. And Kim wasn't playing victim. She was bleeding, screaming, her mask completely shattered. For half a second, Stefano's smile faltered. And in that half second, Gabriele moved. The grief-stricken widower died in that moment. The broken man who'd spent 5 years drowning in sorrow vanished, and the dawn emerged. The man who'd built an empire, the man who'd survived wars, the man who didn't lose. Gabriella grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table. Plates, glasses, wine bottles, all of it crashed to the floor. And then he kicked it. The massive table went up and over like it weighed nothing, landing on its side with a boom that shook the floor. He shoved it forward with his boot, creating a barrier between them and the entrance, between them and the guns. "Sabrina, get down!" His voice was thunder. Command, not a request. Sabrina dropped into a crouch behind the table, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She'd never seen anyone move that fast, never seen that kind of raw power unleashed in a split second. Gabriele crouched beside her, his body between her and the police, using himself as a second shield. The warmth of him, the solid presence, it was overwhelming, protective, possessive. The police were shouting, "Drop the weapon! Hands where we can see them!" But Gabriele wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the massive crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the restaurant, the one that had been there since Il Destino opened, the one that weighed several 100 pounds and hung directly over the entrance. He raised the gun, not at the police, not at his brother, at the chain holding the chandelier to the ceiling, and he fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The sound echoed off marble and glass, making people scream. The bullet hit the chain dead center. Metal shrieked. The chandelier swayed once, twice, and then the chain snapped. Time slowed down. The chandelier fell like a dying star. Thousands of crystals, hundreds of pounds of metal and glass, all crashing down toward the entrance where Stefano and the police stood. They scattered, diving, running, trying to get clear. The chandelier hit the floor with a sound like the end of the world. Glass exploded outward in a wave of glittering shrapnel. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in dim red. Smoke and dust filled the air. People were screaming, running for the side exits. The restaurant had become a war zone. Gabriele grabbed Sabrina's hand. His grip was iron, unbreakable. He pulled her up, his face close to hers in the chaos. "Kitchen," he said, his voice rough. "Go, now." He didn't wait for her to respond. He pulled her behind him, moving through the chaos like he could see in the dark. They ran past overturned tables, past panicking diners, past staff members who dropped to the floor. Mario was there, pressing himself against the wall, his eyes wide. "Go, boss," he said. "Back door." A loyal soldier to the end. They burst through the kitchen doors. The heat hit them first, steam and smoke and the smell of burning food. The kitchen staff had abandoned their stations, running for the exits. Pots boiled over. Flames licked up from an unattended stove. Gabriele didn't slow down. He pulled Sabrina through the maze of steel counters and industrial equipment, his hand never letting go of hers. She could feel his pulse through his palm. Fast but steady, a man in control even in chaos. Behind them, she heard shouting. Stefano's voice, screaming orders. The police regrouping. They had maybe 30 seconds before they were caught. Maybe less. They reached the back door. Gabriele slammed it open with his shoulder. The rain hit them like a wall. Cold, hard. The alley was dark, lit only by a single flickering streetlight at the far end. Garbage bins lined one wall. The smell of rot and rain mixed together. But it was freedom. It was escape. Gabriele turned back for just a second. Through the open door, through the smoke and chaos, his eyes found Stefano, his brother, the man he'd protected his whole life, the man he'd loved. And Stefano stared back, hate burning in his eyes. Betrayal on both sides now. The bond between them didn't just break, it shattered. Burned. Turned to ash. "You're dead to me," Gabriele said, his voice carrying across the space. And then he pulled the door shut and ran. They burst into the rain-soaked alley, leaving behind the ruins of everything that had been. And ahead of them, in the darkness, was everything that would come next. They ran until the sirens faded behind them, until the alley opened onto a side street, where the rain came down so hard it felt like the sky was trying to wash away everything that had happened. Gabriele pulled Sabrina into the shadows between two buildings, pressing her against the wet brick wall, his body shielding her from the street. They were both breathing hard, soaked through. His white shirt clung to his chest, transparent now, showing the ink that covered his skin, the memorials, the scars, the history written on his body. For a long moment, they just stood there, The adrenaline was draining out of Gabriele, leaving something rawer behind, something broken. He was shaking, not from cold, from the weight of everything he'd just learned. His brother had betrayed him. The woman he'd let into his bed had desecrated his wife's grave. He'd been living with a monster for 3 years and never saw it, never knew. And this woman, this waitress he'd never looked at twice, had saved his life, had kept him from rotting in a cell for a murder he didn't commit, had exposed the truth when no one else even knew there was a lie. He looked at her now. Really looked. And he saw it. The resemblance. It was in the eyes. That exact shade of brown that he'd stared into on his wedding day. The shape of her chin. The way she held herself when she was trying to be brave, even though she was terrified. "You look like her," he said, his voice hoarse. "I should have seen it." Sabrina's breath caught. "You weren't looking for me. You were looking for ghosts." Gabriele's hand came up, hesitating, then touched her face. Gentle, like he was afraid she might disappear. "Why?" The word was barely a whisper. "Why would you risk your life for me? I'm nothing to you." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away rain or tears. He couldn't tell anymore. "You could have walked away. You could have let it happen. Why didn't you?" Sabrina's hands were shaking as she reached under her uniform. Her fingers found the chain around her neck, the locket she'd worn every day for 3 years. She pulled it out, the silver catching the dim light from the street. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph, faded but clear, 2 little girls with matching smiles and their arms wrapped around each other. Sisters. Because she was my big sister, Gabriele. Her voice broke on his name. "And I promised her I wouldn't let you die alone." The world stopped. Gabriele stared at the photograph. At the little girl who looked like a younger version of Elena. At the other little girl who looked exactly like the woman standing in front of him. His mind raced backward. Elena had mentioned a sister. Years ago. A kid sister she'd been estranged from after their parents died. But he'd never met her. Never seen a picture. Never thought to ask. And now she was here. Had been here. Watching over him for 3 years while he'd fallen apart. "Elena's sister," he whispered. "You're Elena's sister." His legs gave out. He dropped to his knees in the rain-soaked alley, his hands reaching for hers, holding them like they were the only real things in the world. And then he broke. 5 years of grief came pouring out in gasping, wrenching sobs, not for himself, but for the relief. The overwhelming, devastating relief of knowing that someone had cared enough to stay, that he hadn't been as alone as he'd thought, that Elena's family hadn't abandoned him, that this woman, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, had kept a promise to the dead. "I didn't know," he sobbed, pressing Sabrina's hands to his forehead. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I should have known. I should have." But Sabrina dropped to her knees in front of him, pulling him close. Her arms wrapped around him, and for the first time in 5 years, Gabriele Riccardo let himself be held, let himself be weak, let himself be saved. "It's okay," she whispered into his hair. "I didn't want you to know. I needed to stay invisible. I needed to watch, to wait." She pulled back, her hands framing his face, forcing him to look at her. And in her eyes, he didn't see the quiet waitress anymore. He saw steel. He saw fire. He saw a woman who'd spent 3 years preparing for war. But now they know. Now everyone knows. And we have work to do. She stood up, pulling him with her. And Gabriele realized that something had shifted. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for him to lead. Sabrina Paul, Elena's little sister, the woman who'd served him coffee for 3 years, was stepping into her power. The matriarch, the one who would stand beside him, not behind him. Beside him. "Stefano and Loretta are going to pay for what they did," she said, her voice steady now. Strong. "To Elena, to you, to everyone they've destroyed, but we do this together." Gabriele looked at her, rain streaming down his face, and he saw his future. Not the broken past, not the grief that had consumed him, but a future where he wasn't alone, where family meant something again, where the dead could finally rest because the living had learned to fight. He nodded. Together, they walked to the end of the alley where his black car waited, parked on a side street like he'd always known he might need an escape route. He opened the passenger door for her, not because she was a woman who needed help, but because she was family, because she'd earned his respect in ways no one else ever had. She slid into the car, and he closed the door gently before walking around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, he looked at her one more time. "Elena would be proud of you." Sabrina smiled, and it was sad and fierce all at once. "She'd be proud of both of us. Now let's go finish this." And that is how the waitress saved the dawn. How a promise made to the dead became a war cry for the living. How a family torn apart by tragedy found its way back together through blood and rain and truth. The monster had been exposed. But the war? The war was just beginning. And if you want to hear part 2, where Sabrina and Gabriella take their revenge on Stefano and make sure Loretta pays for every grave she's ever robbed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because this story isn't over. It's only just begun.